The world is almost silent not because it lacks life, but because it lacks us. Wind moves over grasslands where no road will ever be remembered. Rain darkens red soil that no village has claimed. Herds pass through valleys without fences, fires, footprints, graves, names, or stories fixed deeply enough in the earth to survive. Somewhere in Africa, under a sky larger than any human map, a small band of people moves through a landscape that feels endless, because for them it is. They carry stone tools, memory-hunger children, and the fragile knowledge of where water might still lie after the dry season has tightened its grip. They are not primitive shadows waiting for history to begin. They are fully human in body, and perhaps already human in ways that cannot fossilize. Yet their world is so thinly peopled that an entire lifetime may pass within a narrow web of familiar faces, and beyond that web the land stretches into uncertainty. This is the strange beginning of the human story. For roughly the first 250,000 years of Homo sapiens, the planet is not crowded with tribe settlements, migrations, monuments, or myths spreading across continents. It is mostly empty of human presence. Not empty in the natural sense, because the Pleistocene world is crowded with animals, forests, rivers, predators, insects, storms, and immense migrations of other species. It is empty in the human sense. Our ancestors are there, but barely. They are scattered unevenly across parts of Africa in small populations, leaving behind traces so faint that archaeology often has to build a story from broken stone, burned sediment, scraps of bone, and the chemistry locked inside ancient teeth. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how many human groups existed, how often they met, and how connected they truly were. Imagine standing in that early world around 300,000 years ago. The Sahara is not one permanent thing. Sometimes it is a barrier of sand and stone. Sometimes during wetter periods it becomes a corridor of lakes, rivers, grass and animals. East Africa changes as lakes rise and shrink. Southern Africa alternates between harsher and gentler conditions. Forests pull back and return. Coastlines shift as ice grows and melts far away. Human life does not unfold on a stable stage. It unfolds on moving ground under changing skies inside a climate system that repeatedly rearranges the possible. A place that can sustain families for generations may later become too dry. A route that once connects distant people may close. A refuge may become a trap. A harsh landscape may suddenly open like a door. In this world, survival is not a grand march toward destiny. It is daily attention. A person knows the taste of certain roots, the habits of antelope, the warning movements of birds, the stones that break with a useful edge, the season when a riverbed hides water beneath sand. The difference between life and death may be a remembered grove, a grandmother's knowledge of bitter plants made safe, or a toolmaker's patience in striking stone at the right angle. There are no cities, no writing, no domesticated animals, no crops, no pottery, no metal, no permanent architecture in the later sense. But there is skill, there is planning, there is fear, there is affection, there is likely grief. What survives in the record suggests people already move with intention through landscapes they understand intimately, and still compared with what comes later, almost nothing seems to happen. That is the mystery at the center of this story. Homo sapiens appears in Africa hundreds of thousands of years before the great explosion of art, long-distance exchange, rapid expansion, and unmistakable cultural complexity that later transforms the human footprint. For an immense span of time, our species exists without filling the world. It survives without taking over. It adapts without permanently reshaping the planet. It remains local, vulnerable, and sometimes perhaps close to vanishing. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the most remarkable part of human history may not be that everything changed. It may be how long almost nothing seemed to change at all. The word empty can mislead if taken too literally. Early humans were not absent from the world they inhabited. They hunted, gathered, walked, made tools, raised children, learned roots, and probably carried stories that disappeared with the voices that spoke them. But from the viewpoint of deep time, their presence was incredibly light. A small fire might burn for one evening and leave a stain that vanishes under centuries of erosion. A stone blade may fall into sediment and wait for a future excavator, but millions of other acts leave nothing. A child's footprint dries cracks and is gone. A body is taken by scavengers, weather, or soil chemistry. A campsite beside water may be buried, washed away, or never found. The human past is not a library with missing pages. It is more like smoke passing through a cold landscape, with only rare traces caught in stone. The earliest known Homo sapiens fossils show a species still emerging from a wider African human story. They do not appear as a single perfect beginning. Their faces, skulls, and bodies suggest a gradual process spread across populations, not one birthplace where modern humanity suddenly arrives complete. Some fossils look recognizably modern in the face, but retain older features elsewhere. Others reveal how messy the category of us can become when stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. Evolution is not a clean doorway. It is a braided river with channels separating, merging, drying, and flowing again. No single explanation fully accounts for the first appearance of our species, because the evidence points toward a network of African populations shaped by distance, climate, and occasional contact. That braided beginning matters because it helps explain the emptiness. If early Homo sapiens are not one large united people but scattered groups across a continent of shifting habitats, then history begins not with expansion, but with fragmentation. Populations may grow in good times, then shrink when drought returns. Groups may meet after generations apart, exchange genes or tools or partners, then drift away again. Some lineages may disappear completely. Others survive as faint contributions to later ancestry. A great deal of human history may have happened inside groups too small to leave durable archaeological signatures. Entire ways of life may have existed for tens of thousands of years and vanished without one carved image, one burial, or one preserved shelter to announce them. There is a quiet severity to this early human world. A band that loses too many adults loses knowledge as well as labour. A group cut off from neighbours may become vulnerable not only to hunger, but to the slow erosion of ideas. Technologies do not improve simply because intelligence exists. They require teaching repetition, enough people to remember variations, and enough contact for useful innovations to spread. A clever method can die with one person. A better tool form can remain local if no neighbouring group sees it. A symbolic tradition can vanish if the children who learn it do not survive. In a thinly populated world, culture is fragile. It can flicker brightly in one place, then leave almost no trace. This may be one reason the first long age of Homo sapiens feels so empty from a modern perspective. We're used to human history as acceleration villages becoming towns, becoming cities, tools becoming machines, knowledge accumulating faster than any one person can hold. But early human history is not like that. It is a world where knowledge is carried in bodies and voices, where memory walks on two legs, where every generation must rebuild what it knows. The landscape is immense, and the human network is small. If there are breakthroughs, they may not travel far. If there are disasters, recovery may take centuries. The pace of change is not absent, but it is slow, uneven, and difficult to detect. Yet nothing about this slowness means these people are less human. That is one of the traps of the archaeological record. Stone tools preserve better than songs. Pigments preserve better than jokes. Bones preserve better than tenderness. A site with simple artifacts can look simple only because the richest parts of life have vanished. The absence of evidence is not evidence of an empty mind. Early Homo sapiens may have known landscapes in extraordinary detail, maintained social rules, cared for the vulnerable, taught children, used language, marked identity, and imagined the unseen. Some of this is inferred from later humans, some from archaeological hints, and some remains beyond proof. Scholars still debate how far back fully modern behavior reaches, because behavior does not fossilize as cleanly as anatomy. Across the long beginning Earth itself keeps changing. Ice sheets grow in the north, locking away water and lowering seas. Then warmth returns. Seas rise, rivers shift, and coastlines drown. Africa breathes between wet and dry phases. Lakes appear in basins that later become desert. Grasslands expand, forests retreat, animals follow rain, and humans follow animals, plants, stone, and water. The planet does not yet know that one small primate lineage will eventually alter its atmosphere, dam its rivers, cut its forests, and light its nights. For now, humans are still being shaped far more than they shape. They are part of the ecology, not masters of it. And so the opening image remains a few people moving through a world almost impossibly wide. Behind them are ancestors not quite like us. Ahead of them are descendants who will paint caves, cross seas, bury the dead with ornaments, carve ivory, build villages, raise temples, write laws, and launch machines beyond Earth. But none of that is visible yet. What exists is a fragile human thread running through deep time. It stretches across droughts, green corridors, lost migrations, and silent generations. For 250,000 years that thread does not break. That alone is astonishing. The first act of human history is not conquest, invention, or civilization. It is endurance in an almost empty world. The people moving through that almost empty world do not appear from nowhere. They are the result of a long African story older than the name Homo sapiens, older than the faces that look back from the earliest fossils and seem in certain angles of bone strangely familiar. Before there is a species that can be called fully ours, there are populations spread across Africa with bodies and skulls changing slowly over time. Some live near lakes and rivers. Some move through open grasslands. Some endure dry interiors. Some adapt to wooded regions where visibility is broken by shade and leaves. They are not stepping stones arranged in a neat line. They are branches crossing survivors and disappearances in a landscape that keeps rearranging them. This is why the birth of Homo sapiens is not a single dramatic moment. There is no first morning when a modern human wakes beneath an acacia tree and begins history. The evidence points instead to a gradual emergence across many generations, perhaps across many regions, as different traits appear and combine. A more rounded skull here, a flatter, more modern-looking face there, a lighter skeleton in one population, a changing pattern of growth movement and brain shape in another. Some fossils from early Homo sapiens do not look exactly like people today, yet they are close enough to make the distance feel intimate. They remind us that modern is not a switch, it is a process. Around 300,000 years ago, fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco reveal people with faces surprisingly like ours, but with skull shapes that still carry older features. Far to the east and south, other African fossils add different pieces to the puzzle. The record is patchy, uneven, and often frustrating. Bones survive by chance, and chance is not a careful historian. Still, what survives suggests that our species formed inside a wide African population network rather than at one small birthplace. Scholars still debate the exact pattern, but the older picture of one cradle giving rise to one sudden expansion has become harder to maintain. Humanity's beginning looks less like a single spark and more like embers scattered across a vast dark field glowing at different times, sometimes connected by wind. Climate plays a quiet but powerful role in this formation. Africa during these deep centuries is not static. Wet periods turn parts of the Sahara into grassland with lakes and rivers. Dry periods break those corridors apart. Forests shift. Deserts expand. Animals move. Human groups follow waterstone plants and prey, but their movements are shaped by barriers that appear and disappear over thousands of years. When climates are favourable, separated populations may reconnect. When conditions worsen, they may retreat into refuges and become isolated again. Over immense time, this rhythm can create a braided pattern of human evolution, with groups separated long enough to develop differences, then meeting again often enough to remain part of one wider ancestry. This matters because it gives early humanity a strange shape. Our species begins not as a crowd, but as a scattered possibility. There may be no large unified human world, yet no continuous chain of communities stretching across the continent. Instead, there are pockets of people, some thriving for a time, some vanishing, some leaving descendants who will later mix into larger populations. Genetic evidence from living people points to deep structure in ancient Africa, meaning that the ancestors of modern humans were not one simple population. There were old divisions, old reunions, and lineages that are now mostly ghosts. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests that even before humans left Africa in lasting numbers, Africa itself contained many human worlds. The bodies of these early people reveal both familiarity and distance. Their hands can grip shape and strike stone. Their feet carry them over long ranges. Their faces in some cases would not seem entirely alien if softened by flesh and expression. Yet the skull is still changing. The brain is large, but brain size alone is not the whole story. Shape wiring development and social use matter as much as volume. A modern human brain is not merely a large organ. It is an organ growing inside a social world trained by language, imitation, memory, and cooperation. How much of that inner life already exists in the earliest Homo sapiens remains one of the great uncertainties. We can measure bone. We cannot directly measure a vanished thought. Still, the archaeological traces show capable minds. Stone tools from this broad period are not crude accidents. They require planning knowledge of raw materials and controlled technique. Some tool-making traditions involve preparing a stone core so that flakes can be struck in predictable shapes. This is not random smashing. It is a mental sequence held in advance. The maker sees not only the stone that is present, but the form hidden inside it. In some places, people transport stone from particular sources, suggesting movement across known landscapes or exchange between groups. In others, they use pigments such as ochre, though the meaning of that use is not always clear. It may be practical, symbolic, decorative, or all of these at once. No single explanation fully accounts for every trace. What is striking is how long this early world remains balanced between ability and restraint. The people are intelligent, they are adaptable, they survive in difficult environments, yet there is no immediate surge into the entire planet, no sudden cascade of art and complex technology everywhere. This is the paradox at the heart of the first 250,000 years. The ingredients of later humanity are slowly assembling, but the recipe has not yet transformed the world. Perhaps population size is too small. Perhaps networks are too weak. Perhaps climate repeatedly interrupts growth. Perhaps innovations arise but fail to spread. Perhaps the symbolic and linguistic capacities that later define human expansion are still developing, or perhaps they already exist but leave almost no durable record. Scholars still debate where the real threshold lies. There is also a humbling possibility early Homo sapiens may not have known they were special, because for a very long time they were not obviously dominant. They shared a planet with powerful predators, enormous herbivores, harsh climates, and eventually other kinds of humans beyond Africa. Their survival was not guaranteed. A drought could erase a local group. Disease, conflict, isolation, or simple bad luck could thin a population until its knowledge vanished. In such a world, being anatomically modern did not automatically mean becoming historically unstoppable. The future was still uncertain, and the line leading to us may have been narrow more than once. The slow birth of our species therefore feels less like a triumphal beginning and more like a long negotiation with instability. Human bodies become more modern, while landscapes keep shifting beneath them. Populations separate and reconnect. Knowledge accumulates, breaks, and accumulates again. The earliest people who belong to our species are not waiting at the edge of civilization. They are living completely within their own world with no promise that anything larger will follow. They know the smell of rain before it reaches them, the danger of a wounded animal, the weight of a sleeping child, the value of a sharp edge. They may know stories of places beyond the horizon, though those stories are gone. They may mark skinstone or memory in ways we cannot recover, and from this long uncertainty the human line continues, not because it is destined, but because enough groups survive enough crises for the thread to keep moving. The empty world is not empty of drama. Its drama is simply quiet and dispersed across time. A population endures in one region while another fades. A corridor opens, a family moves, a tool form spreads, a child grows into an elder and carries knowledge through another dry season. These are small events almost invisible individually, but together they shape the species that will later change everything. Before humanity expands outward, it first has to become itself slowly, unevenly, and under conditions that leave only fragments behind. For most of this early age, a human life is lived inside distance. Not the measured distance of maps, roads, or borders, but the older distance of heat-thirst, mountains, predators, unfamiliar valleys, and silence. A band may know its home range with astonishing precision. Every seasonal waterhole, every useful tree, every place where good stone can be found, every dangerous crossing where animals gather and carnivores wait. Yet beyond that known world, the land widens quickly into uncertainty. A ridge may hide another group or no one at all. A river may lead toward abundance or toward sickness and exhaustion. A dry plain that seems passable in one generation may become lethal in the next. Human beings are present, but they are not yet woven into a dense fabric. They are knots of life separated by enormous spaces. This is one of the hardest things to imagine from the modern world. Today, even remote places are usually touched by aircraft routes, satellites, radio signals, old trade paths, tourist maps, fences, survey lines, or plastic debris. In the early Homo sapiens world, there are no such webs. A person cannot assume that beyond the horizon there will be strangers with related customs, shared stories, or familiar tools. There may be people, but there may also be long stretches where no human voice is heard for weeks or months. The empty world is not a poetic exaggeration. In demographic terms, human populations may have been extremely small, sometimes scattered so thinly that chance encounters between distant groups could carry enormous significance. Small bands are resilient in some ways. They can move quickly. They do not need fields, granaries, walls, or permanent buildings. Their wealth is knowledge rather than possessions. They can shift with seasons, follow animal movements, return to plants when they ripen, and avoid places that have become dangerous. But small bands are also fragile. A few deaths can change everything. The loss of a skilled toolmaker, an experienced tracker, a healer, or an elder who remembers rare droughts can weaken the group in ways that are invisible archaeologically. A child born into such a world inherits not land titles or written laws, but a living library of practical memory. If that library is broken, survival becomes harder. The size of a group matters for culture as much as for food. In a thin population, ideas have trouble travelling. A new way of shaping a point, preparing a hide, carrying water, binding a haft, mixing pigment, or organising a hunt may be brilliant, but brilliance alone does not guarantee permanence. If only a handful of people learn it and they are isolated, the idea may vanish. Later human history often feels like a story of accumulation, where inventions pile upon inventions. But accumulation requires networks. It requires enough people to copy, modify, remember, and transmit. In the first Long Age, culture may often have behaved more like fire in wind, sometimes spreading, sometimes dying back, sometimes leaving no visible ash. This does not mean early life is culturally empty. It means much of its richness is unrecoverable. A group may have rules about marriage, sharing childhood territory, mourning, and the treatment of strangers. It may classify animals in ways that combine observation with meaning. It may remember floods, fires, migrations, and dangerous places through stories. It may decorate bodies with pigment or objects that rarely preserve. It may use gestures, songs, or spoken traditions to bind people together across generations. What survives in the record suggests skill and planning, but the social world behind those traces is mostly invisible. Scholars still debate how far symbolic behaviour extended in these early populations, partly because absence in the ground can mean absence in life, or simply absence of preservation. Distance also shapes mating and ancestry. A tiny, isolated group cannot remain healthy forever without some contact beyond itself. People must sometimes move between bands, whether through partnership, adoption, exchange alliance, or conflict. These movements may be among the most important events in early human history, yet they leave almost no direct trace. A young woman or man crossing into another group may carry genes, techniques, songs, and memories. A meeting at a seasonal lake may renew ties that have been quiet for years. A failed meeting may leave hostility or death. Population structure is not an abstract genetic pattern to the people living it. It is the lived reality of who counts as kin, who can be trusted, and how far one may travel safely. The landscape itself encourages this patchwork. Africa is vast and its habitats are not evenly distributed. A band living near a lake in East Africa faces different opportunities from one near a southern coastline, a wooded basin, a highland edge, or a dry interior corridor. Some regions offer predictable resources, others demand constant movement. Stone suitable for tools is abundant in one place and rare in another. Large animals gather seasonally, then disappear. Rivers flood and shrink. In wetter periods, paths open through regions that later become forbidding. In drier periods, populations may contract toward refugees crowding around remaining water or breaking apart into smaller units. The human map is repeatedly drawn and erased by climate. One lesser-known detail of this early world is that mobility does not mean wandering aimlessly. Hunter-gatherer movement, ancient or recent, is often highly structured. People may travel long distances across a year while still following a remembered pattern. They move through a known calendar of ripening plants, animal births, dry season water, raw material sources, and social gatherings. To an outsider, the band may seem nomadic. To those inside it, the landscape is full of addresses, though none are written. A particular hill may signal the turn toward a stone outcrop. A line of trees may mark underground moisture. A stretch of ground may be avoided because someone once died there, or because predators use it, or because the plants nearby are unreliable. Such knowledge can persist for generations without leaving a single monument. This makes early emptiness more complex. The world may look untouched from the air, but to the people moving through it, it is already storied. Their presence is light but not meaningless. They may burn patches of vegetation intentionally or accidentally affecting local ecologies in small ways. They may influence animal behavior through hunting pressure in certain places. They may return to favored camps again and again, leaving layered traces that only sometimes survive. But the scale remains modest. Unlike later agricultural societies, they do not force landscapes into permanent human shapes. They live by reading change rather than resisting it completely. The emotional geography of such a world must have been intense. A distant smoke column might mean other humans, and other humans might mean opportunity or danger. A strange footprint could carry more importance than any written message. The arrival of outsiders could bring new mates, new stories, new tools, new risks or violence. In a sparsely populated world, each encounter is magnified. People are rare enough to matter deeply. The death of one group may leave a valley without human voices for generations. The survival of another may depend on remembering that beyond a dry ridge there is sometimes water when the rains fail. Over thousands of years, these small bands create a pattern almost impossible to narrate in ordinary historical terms. There are no kings, no battles with names, no dynasties, no inscriptions claiming victory. There are movements, separations, reunions, losses and continuities. The story is demographic, ecological and intimate all at once. It unfolds in the carrying of children, the sharing of meat, the making of blades, the watching of clouds, the cautious approach to another campfire. The evidence remains incomplete, but the logic of survival suggests that early Homo sapiens lived inside a delicate balance between isolation and connection. That balance helps explain why the first 250,000 years do not immediately become a story of expansion. The species has the body, the brain, and the adaptability, but the network is still too thin to transform the planet. Human groups can survive locally without becoming a global force. They can innovate without creating irreversible momentum. They can occupy landscapes without filling them. For a very long time, humanity is not a wave. It is a scatter of sparks, each one bright to those gathered around it, yet separated from the others by darkness, weather, and distance. And still those sparks keep appearing. A group survives a drought. Another reaches a new valley. A child born between two lineages carries a mixed ancestry forward. A tool-making habit crosses from one band into another. A remembered route becomes useful again when the rains return. The world remains almost empty, but not still. Under the silence, connections are forming and breaking tiny threads, stretching across immense spaces. Much later, those threads will thicken into networks strong enough to carry ideas across continents. But in this early age, they are fragile, easily snapped, and precious beyond measure. The first map of humanity is not drawn by human hands. It is drawn by rain. It is drawn by heat, ice dust, rivers, coastlines, grass, and the slow breathing of the planet. Long before people carve boundaries into land or name territories as kingdoms, climate decides where movement is possible and where it becomes almost impossible. For early Homo sapiens, the world is not a fixed stage waiting to be crossed. It is a shifting maze. A green corridor can become desert. A lake can become salt and cracked mud. A coastline can move so far that an old camp vanishes beneath the sea. A valley full of animals can empty within a few generations. In this first long age, survival depends not only on intelligence, but on reading a planet that never holds still. Africa during the deep history of Homo sapiens is especially dynamic. The Sahara, which modern imagination often treats as a timeless desert, has repeatedly changed character. During wetter phases, parts of it hold lakes, rivers, wetlands, grasslands, and animals that would seem impossible there today. Fish bones, ancient shorelines, fossil pollen, and lake sediments preserve traces of these vanished green worlds. During dry phases, the same broad region becomes a barrier of sandstone heat and distance. This rhythm matters profoundly. When the Sahara is greener, it can connect northern and sub-Saharan regions, allowing animals and perhaps humans to move through corridors that later close. When it dries, populations become separated again, cut off by a landscape that punishes mistakes. This opening and closing of routes may help explain the fragmented shape of early human history. People are not simply spreading outward at a steady pace. They are being gathered, divided, redirected, and sometimes trapped by environmental change. A wet phase may allow a group to move into a new region. A return of drought may isolate their descendants for thousands of years. Some groups may survive in refuges near reliable water. Others may disappear, leaving only a few tools or a faint genetic echo. Scholars still debate exactly how these climatic cycles shaped population structure, because the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad pattern is clear enough: climate repeatedly changes the rules of movement. The same is true beyond the Sahara. East African lakes rise and fall, sometimes dramatically. In one period, a basin may hold abundant fresh water, attracting animals, plants, and human groups. In another, the lake shrinks, becomes more saline, or vanishes, forcing movement toward better watered regions. Southern Africa offers coastlines, caves, fynbos vegetation, shellfish, and inland resources, but its productivity also changes with rainfall and sea level. Central African forests expand and contract. Highland zones create cooler pockets. River systems shift. Human beings live inside all of this, not as passive victims, but as attentive inhabitants whose choices are constrained by forces larger than any band can control. Far to the north, ice sheets grow across parts of Eurasia and North America. Even though early Homo sapiens begin in Africa, those distant ice sheets matter because they lock away vast amounts of water. Sea levels fall, continental shelves emerge, coastlines move outward, sometimes by many kilometers. Land bridges or shorter sea crossings appear in places where later water will return. Then, when the climate warms and ice melts, seas rise again, drowning old shorelines. This creates one of the great problems for archaeologists studying early humans. Many of the places people may have used most heavily are now underwater. Coastal camps, shellfish, gathering sites, migration routes, and lowland refuges may lie beneath modern seas erased from easy view. What survives on land may not represent the full story. This missing coastline is especially important because coasts can be generous landscapes. They offer shellfish, fish, seabirds, marine mammals, edible plants, freshwater outlets, and raw materials washed from inland. They can act as routes guiding movement along the edge between land and sea. Later human expansions seem to make use of coastal pathways in some regions, and it is possible that earlier populations did as well. But much of the evidence may be drowned. No single explanation fully accounts for the gaps in the record, and underwater archaeology remains difficult, expensive, and limited. The early human map may be missing some of its most important roads. Climate also shapes animals, and animals shape humans. Herds move with grass and water. Predators follow prey. Scavenging opportunities shift. The availability of large animals affects hunting, but so does the availability of smaller, more predictable foods. A drought does not simply mean less water. It changes the whole structure of risk. Animals concentrate near waterholes, which may help hunters, but also draw dangerous carnivores. Plants fail in some areas and thrive in others. Competition increases. Groups may be pushed closer together, making cooperation possible in one case, and conflict more likely in another. The landscape becomes not only a physical challenge, but a social one. One surprising detail is that environmental stress does not always slow innovation. Sometimes it may encourage it. When familiar resources become unreliable, people may experiment with new foods, new tools, new routes, or new alliances. But stress can also break populations apart and cause knowledge to disappear. This is the central tension of early human adaptation. Hard times can sharpen skill, yet they can also reduce the number of people needed to preserve that skill. A clever solution born in crisis may not survive if the group that discovers it collapses. The archaeological record may therefore show long periods of apparent stability, interrupted by local bursts of change, not because people lacked imagination, but because culture itself depended on demographic survival. The changing climate also gives early humans a sense of time very different from written history. Individuals experience seasons, droughts, storms, and perhaps rare disasters. Generations remember old water sources, animal returns, dangerous dry years, or the loss of a place. But the larger cycles unfold across thousands or tens of thousands of years, too slowly for any single person to perceive fully. A region becoming gradually drier may seem in human terms like a series of bad years, then a hard generation, then a changed world. People adapt step by step, not knowing that future scientists will call it a climatic transition. The great planetary rhythm is lived as hunger, movement, memory, and choice. There is quiet tragedy in the places that open and close. Imagine a green Sahara lake where people camp for generations. Children learn to fish in its shallows. Hunters follow antelope across its margins. Stone tools are made beside water. Fires burn under night skies. Then over centuries rainfall patterns shift. The lake shrinks. Grass thins. Animals leave. The people move, or they die, or they merge with others elsewhere. Eventually the lake bed becomes dust. The camp is buried, scattered, or exposed to erosion. Tens of thousands of years later, researchers may find a shoreline, a fossil, a tool, and reconstruct a vanished world from fragments. What survives in the record suggests life once flourished, where today the landscape seems almost empty. These vanished green corridors and drowned shores complicate any simple story of human progress. They remind us that early Homo sapiens did not spread through a neutral world. They expanded when doors opened and retreated when doors closed. They were capable, but capability still needed opportunity. Even the most skilled group cannot cross a lethal desert without water. Even the most curious people cannot follow a coastline that has vanished beneath rising seas. Human history begins as a partnership with geography, and geography often holds the stronger hand. Yet climate is not destiny in a simple sense. The same environmental pressure can produce different outcomes depending on population size, social connections, technology, and luck. One group may respond to drought by moving toward a river refuge. Another may strengthen alliances with neighbors. Another may split, sending families in different directions. Another may disappear. This variability is important because it prevents the story from becoming mechanical. Climate writes the broad conditions, but people still make choices within them. They observe, remember risk, hesitate, and adapt. Their decisions are mostly invisible, but they are not absent. As the first 250,000 years unfold, the planet keeps testing the scattered human thread. Wet phases give room, dry phases tighten, ice ages lower seas, Warm periods drown old roots. Forests and grasslands trade places. The human map is rewritten again and again, but it is not erased. Somewhere always enough people remain. They carry knowledge from one altered landscape into another. They learn that the world can change beyond the memory of elders. They learn perhaps that survival belongs not to those who know one perfect home, but to those who can move between homes and remember how to begin again. This is the deeper meaning of the climate map. It does not merely explain where early humans went. It explains why their first history was so slow, so fragile and so uneven. The world kept offering possibilities, then withdrawing them. Human presence expanded, contracted, and shifted like a pulse. For a very long time that pulse remained faint, but every corridor that opened, every refuge that held, every coastline that guided movement, added another chance for connection. The empty world was being prepared not by intention, but by instability itself. And in that instability, the scattered sparks of humanity learned the oldest lesson of the species: the ground changes and life must move. For a very long time, the most durable sign of human intelligence is stone. Not cities, not statues, not written marks, not temples rising over plains, but stone broken with care. A flake struck from a prepared core, a point shaped for cutting, scraping, piercing, or hafting. A tool carried away from the place where the raw material was found. These objects are quiet, small, and easy to underestimate. Yet they are among the few witnesses that survive when bodies decay, voices vanish, wood rots, hide disappears, and entire camps dissolve back into soil. The first long age of Homo sapiens is therefore seen through an oddly narrow window, not what people said, believed, feared, remembered, or sang, but what they could make from rock. At first glance, this can make early human history appear almost motionless. Stone tool traditions continue across immense spans of time. A technique may persist for tens of thousands of years. A general way of preparing cores or producing flakes may spread across huge regions without the kind of dramatic replacement that later archaeology sometimes shows. To modern eyes trained by a world where technology changes every few years, this slowness can seem baffling. Humans already have large brains. They already survive in varied environments. They already plan, cooperate, and teach. So why does technology not accelerate immediately? Why does the first 250,000 years of our species not produce a visible storm of invention? The answer begins with the material itself. Stone preserves too well and not well enough. It preserves the hard edge, but not the full technology around it. A stone point may have been part of a spear with a wooden shaft, plant fiber binding, resin adhesive, and a hunting strategy that required group coordination. The stone survives, the rest usually vanishes. A scraper may imply hide working, but the hides, clothing bags, shelters, and sleeping mats are gone. A blade may have cut plants, meat, sinew, or wood, but the action is absent. Early technology may have been far richer than the surviving record suggests. The problem is not that people only had stone. The problem is that stone is what time allows us to see. Even within stone there is more skill than the simple shapes suggest. Preparing a core requires foresight. The maker must understand angles, force fracture, and sequence. Strike too hard and the stone shatters badly. Strike too softly and the flake fails. Choose the wrong raw material and the tool will not hold an edge. Some methods require shaping the core in advance so that one careful blow releases a useful flake. This means the toolmaker holds a future form in the mind before it exists. Such work is not merely manual, it is conceptual, learned through observation, correction, and repetition. What survives in the record suggests a deep tradition of teaching, because complex stoneworking does not reliably appear anew in every generation without instruction. Still, the pace of change remains slow, and that slowness may reveal something important about human societies rather than human minds. Technology does not advance simply because a clever individual invents something. It advances when an idea can be retained, copied, improved, and distributed. That requires social density. It requires enough learners, enough teachers, enough contact between groups, and enough stability for mistakes to be corrected rather than forgotten. In sparse populations, even useful inventions can vanish. A better hafting technique may die with one lineage. A new hunting weapon may remain confined to one valley. A pigment practice may disappear after a drought breaks a community apart. No single explanation fully accounts for early technological stability, but small population networks likely played a major role. There is a harsh arithmetic to culture. If a skill is difficult to learn, a group needs enough skilled people to teach it. If only one or two individuals know the full method, the loss of those people can erase it. If children must spend most of their time gathering food, moving camp, or surviving illness, fewer hours may be available for slow craft specialization. If neighboring bands rarely meet innovations spread poorly, the first long age of Homo sapiens may have been full of small experiments that never became global traditions. The archaeological record would then look conservative, not because minds were static, but because the social conditions for cumulative culture were fragile. This possibility changes how the empty world should be understood. It was not empty because nothing was being invented. It may have been empty because innovations had too few pathways to travel. A spark in one place could not easily become a wildfire. The later human world, with its vast exchange networks, trade routes, migrations, and eventually writing, makes accumulation seem natural. But accumulation is an achievement. It depends on connections. Early humans may have had many bright moments, many local breakthroughs, many clever adaptations to specific landscapes, but without thick networks, those moments remained local and vulnerable. There are hints, however, that technology was not standing still. Across parts of Africa, the Middle Stone Age shows varied tool traditions, prepared. Core techniques points that may have been hafted onto spears, blades, scrapers, and regionally distinct approaches. In some places, people heat-treated stone to improve its flaking qualities, a process requiring controlled fire and careful timing. This is a lesser-known but remarkable detail. Heat treatment is not obvious. It demands an understanding that stone can be transformed before it is worked, that fire can alter the material hidden inside the rock. Too little heat changes little. Too much can ruin it. Such practices reveal patience and experiment even if they do not announce themselves as a revolution. Adhesives may tell an even subtler story. Hafting a stone point onto wood often requires glue-like substances made from plant resins, gums, ochre mixtures, or other materials. Compound adhesives can involve gathering ingredients, heating them, mixing them, and applying them before they harden. The finished weapon is a composite tool made of several materials that behave differently. Stone is only the visible tip of a technological system. When researchers find traces of such hafting, they glimpse a world of planning that stretches beyond the artifact. A spear point is not just a stone. It is a chain of decisions: where to find the stone, how to shape it, what wood to use, how to bind it, when to repair it, how to carry it, and when to risk it in a hunt. Fire adds another layer. Earlier humans used fire long before Homo sapiens, but fire in the hands of our ancestors is not only warmth and protection. It is a tool for cooking, social gathering, landscape, use, material transformation, and perhaps memory itself. Around a fire, teaching can extend beyond daylight. Food becomes safer or easier to digest. Predators may be kept away. Wood can be hardened. Stone can be heated. Pigments can be altered. Yet fire also rarely leaves a full record. Ash blows away. Hearths erode. A burned patch may be hard to interpret. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how consistently early humans controlled fire in different places and periods. But where fire is present, the human world becomes more complex than stone alone suggests. The slow pace of visible technology may also reflect a different relationship to need. Modern invention often responds to markets, competition, institutions, and accumulation of specialized knowledge. Early invention responds to survival within a particular ecology. If a toolkit works well enough for available food materials and mobility, radical change may not be necessary. A hunter-gatherer technology can be elegant precisely because it is simple, repairable, portable, and reliable. Carrying too much is a burden. A tool that does many jobs may be more valuable than a specialized object that works beautifully in only one situation. What looks stagnant from a distance may up close be a stable solution to a demanding life, and yet beneath that stability pressure is building. Every prepared core teaches sequence, every hefted point teaches combination, every carried stone teaches planning over distance, every controlled fire teaches transformation. Every child watching an elder make a tool learns not just the shape of the object but the discipline of attention. Human culture is slowly training itself to persist. Even without a visible revolution, habits of teaching, imitation, correction, and shared standards are deepening. These habits may be more important than any single artifact. A species does not transform the world merely by having hands and brains. It transforms the world when knowledge becomes strong enough to outlive individuals. So the absence of a technological explosion during the first long age is not a failure. It is a clue. It points to a world where people are skilled but scattered, inventive but vulnerable, observant but limited by the reach of their networks. Their tools do not shout. They accumulate quietly in caves, river terraces, lake margins, and buried landscapes. They mark evenings of work hunts, prepared hides, scraped plants, cut fires, tended journeys made. They remind us that human history begins not with sudden brilliance, but with patient repetition. A stone edge is struck, used, lost, and buried. Another is made, then another. Across thousands of generations, the gesture continues. One day, much later, human technology will begin to accelerate in ways that are impossible to miss. Artifacts will become more diverse ornaments, more common exchange, more visible weapons, more specialized and symbolic objects, more durable. But that later transformation rests on this older foundation. The long age of stone without revolution is not an empty pause before real history. It is the training ground of human attention. It is where minds learn to see possibility in matter, where hands learn inherited sequences, where culture survives by being repeated carefully enough to cross the dangerous gap between generations. In the almost empty world, every tool is small, but the habit behind it is enormous. Much of what defines human life leaves no fossil at all. There are no bones that record a shared joke, no sediment layer that preserves a lesson taught beside a fire, no stone tool that fully captures trust between people who depend on each other in a dangerous landscape. And yet beneath the visible traces of early Homo sapiens there must have been a dense and complex social world, because survival in such an environment is not an individual achievement. It is collective. A single person, no matter how skilled, cannot easily endure alone for long. Food must be shared. Knowledge must be transmitted, children must be protected, and risks must be managed together. The invisible architecture of early humanity is social, and it may be one of the most important reasons the species endures at all. In small bands, every relationship carries weight. Cooperation is not abstract. It is immediate and often necessary. A hunt may require coordination, patience, and timing among several individuals. Gathering may depend on shared knowledge of plant locations and seasonal cycles. Caring for the sick or injured can determine whether valuable experience is preserved or lost. Even the division of food is a decision that shapes group stability. If sharing fails, resentment grows. If it succeeds, bonds strengthen. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were capable of such cooperation, because many tasks implied by tools and subsistence patterns would be difficult without it. Kinship likely forms the core of these early groups, but kinship itself is not simple. It includes parents, children, siblings, extended relatives, and possibly adopted or allied individuals. Rules about who belongs, who marries whom, and how people move between groups must exist, even if they leave no clear trace. These rules may vary across regions and over time. They may be flexible, adapting to population size and environmental pressure. Scholars still debate the exact structure of early human social organization, but it is unlikely to be random. Patterns of cooperation, sharing, and movement would need some stability to function across generations. Language, or something very close to it, is almost certainly part of this invisible world. The precise form of early human communication remains uncertain because speech does not fossilize, but the demands of cooperation suggest that information must be shared with some efficiency. Complex hunting strategies, knowledge of distant resources, warnings about danger, teaching of tool-making, and the maintenance of social bonds all benefit from communication beyond simple gestures. Whether fully modern language exists in the earliest Homo sapiens populations or develops gradually is still debated, but the trajectory points toward increasing communicative complexity. No single explanation fully accounts for how language emerged, but its presence becomes harder to deny as social systems grow more intricate. Teaching is another silent force. A child does not learn to nap, stone, identify edible plants, track animals, or navigate terrain by accident. These skills require demonstration, correction, and repetition. Teaching does not have to be formal, but it must be effective. An elder showing how to strike a core at the correct angle is passing more than a technique. They're passing a way of seeing cause and effect, a sense of timing, and a tradition that links generations. In a small population, teaching may be the difference between continuity and loss. If knowledge is not transmitted accurately enough, it disappears. If it is transmitted well, it can persist for thousands of years, even without written records. Memory, both individual and collective, becomes a form of survival technology. People remember where water can be found during dry periods, which plants are safe or dangerous, which routes lead to resources, which animals behave unpredictably, and which places should be avoided. They may also remember events: a flood that destroyed a camp, a fire that spread unexpectedly, a time when animals failed to arrive. Such memories can shape decisions long after the original event has passed. They may be encoded in stories repeated and adjusted across generations. These stories do not survive in direct form, but their existence is implied by the continuity of knowledge in changing environments. Symbolic behavior may already be present, though its extent remains uncertain. The use of pigments like ochre found in some Middle Stone Age sites suggests that materials were valued for reasons beyond immediate function. Pigments could be used for body decoration, marking objects, or perhaps signaling identity or status. Small pieces of modified bone or shell in later periods hint at ornamentation. Whether these practices are widespread or localized, whether they carry shared meaning across groups or vary widely, is still debated. The evidence remains incomplete, but even limited signs suggest that early humans were not only practical beings, they were also meaning makers capable of assigning significance to objects and actions. Emotion, though invisible, must also be part of this early human world. Fear of predators, anxiety during drought relief at finding water, grief at death, attachment to children, loyalty to companions, these experiences shape behavior and decision-making. They influence how groups respond to crisis, how they treat the vulnerable, and how they maintain cohesion. While we cannot recover specific emotional expressions, the continuity of human biology suggests that the emotional range was already present. What may differ is how emotions are expressed and managed within different cultural frameworks. One lesser known but important detail is the potential care for injured or disabled individuals. In some later prehistoric contexts, there is evidence that individuals with significant injuries survived long enough to heal, implying assistance from others. While direct evidence from the earliest Homo sapiens populations is sparse, the possibility suggests that compassion and social support are not recent developments. They may be deeply rooted in human evolution. Caring for someone who cannot immediately contribute to survival requires a social system that values more than short-term efficiency. The invisible social world also includes conflict. Competition over resources, territory, or mates could lead to tension between groups. Encounters with unfamiliar people might be cautious or hostile. Violence may occur, though evidence is difficult to interpret at this early stage. At the same time, cooperation between groups could offer advantages such as access to new resources, genetic diversity, and shared knowledge. The balance between conflict and cooperation likely varies depending on environmental conditions and population density. In a sparsely populated world, both outcomes carry significant consequences. All of these elements — communication, teaching, memory, symbolism, emotion, cooperation, conflict — form a network that does not fossilize but is essential for understanding early human life. They create a social fabric that allows small groups to persist in challenging environments. Without this fabric, the scattered sparks of humanity would likely have faded. With it, they endure even when conditions are harsh and populations are thin. This invisible world may also explain why the first long age does not produce immediate visible transformation. Social systems are developing, but they are still limited by scale. Networks exist, but they are not yet wide or dense enough to support rapid cultural accumulation. Knowledge is shared within groups and occasionally between them, but it does not yet flow freely across large regions. The foundation is being laid quietly in daily interactions that leave almost no trace. Over time, these interactions will matter more and more. As populations grow and connections increase, the same mechanisms — teaching, communication, cooperation — will allow ideas to spread farther and faster. The invisible will begin to shape the visible. Tools will diversify. Symbols will multiply. Networks will expand. But in this early period, the social world remains largely hidden, its importance inferred rather than observed. The almost empty world, then, is not empty of meaning. It is full of relationships that cannot be easily seen. It is full of knowledge carried in minds rather than objects. It is full of bonds that hold small groups together across generations. These bonds are the quiet force that keeps humanity alive through long stretches of uncertainty. They do not announce themselves in stone or bone, but without them the story would end before it truly begins. Some of the most important people in early human history have no graves, no faces, and no names. They survive only as patterns inside living bodies, faint signals in DNA, traces of populations that once existed and then vanished so completely that archaeology has not yet found them, or may never find them at all. The ground gives us stone tools and occasional bones, but the genome gives another kind of evidence, a shadow record of unions, separations, bottlenecks, expansions, and disappearances. It reveals that the first long age of Homo sapiens was not simply sparse. It was haunted by lost branches of humanity, by groups that contributed to later people and then disappeared into time. Genetic evidence has changed the way the early human story is understood. For a long time, fossils and artifacts carried most of the weight. They still matter deeply, but DNA has made the story stranger and more intricate. It suggests that ancient African populations were structured, separated, and sometimes deeply divided before later mixing drew their descendants together. In other words, the ancestors of modern humans were not one smooth population moving forward in a straight line. They were a network of groups, some connected often enough to remain related, others isolated long enough to become distinct. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because ancient DNA preserves poorly in many African environments, but even the partial picture points toward a far more tangled past. A population bottleneck is one of the most unsettling ideas in this story. It means that at certain times the number of people contributing to future generations may have become very small. Not necessarily the total number of humans alive everywhere, but the number whose descendants survived into the later genetic record. A lineage can vanish even if its people lived fully human lives for thousands of years. Their children may fail to leave descendants far into the future. Their group may be absorbed, replaced, or broken by drought, disease, isolation, or chance. To the people living through it, there is no awareness that they are approaching a genetic cliff. There is only a hard season, a failed hunt, a shrinking water source, a dangerous journey, a child who does not survive. These bottlenecks help explain why the early world can be both inhabited and nearly invisible. Many groups may have existed, yet only a narrow portion of them becomes ancestral to most living humans. The rest are not unimportant. They are simply lost from the main line of descent, like rivers that once ran across a plain and later dried before reaching the sea. Scholars still debate the timing, severity, and causes of ancient population contractions, but the broad lesson is clear: survival. In deep time is not evenly distributed. Some populations leave enormous genetic legacies, others leave almost none. There are also hints of ghost populations, ancient groups inferred from genetic patterns rather than identified from fossils. These are among the most mysterious figures in the human story. They may represent populations that split from the ancestors of living humans long ago and later mixed back in leaving fragments of ancestry behind. They may have lived in parts of Africa where preservation is poor or archaeological work remains limited. They may have looked very much like other humans or somewhat different. Without bones, tools, or camps clearly tied to them, they remain difficult to imagine. Yet their genetic echoes suggest that early Africa contained human diversity, now mostly erased from the visible record. This hidden diversity matters because it challenges the idea of a clean origin. Homo sapiens was not born as one population that simply expanded and replaced all others. The deeper story appears to include long periods of separation and reunion, with populations exchanging genes after ages apart. This kind of structure can preserve variation. It can also create a species shaped by mixture from the beginning. The modern human body may carry the result of many ancient meetings that no archaeology can locate. A person today may hold in tiny inherited fragments the legacy of groups that lived in landscapes now desert, forest coast or sea floor, and whose material traces are gone. DNA also reveals how small and fragile early human populations may have been compared with later ones. In the modern world, humanity numbers in billions, and it is tempting to project abundance backward. But for most of Homo sapiens' history, our species may have consisted of relatively small populations spread across vast spaces. Such small numbers make extinction a real possibility. A large mammal species with scattered groups is always vulnerable to environmental shock. Humans had culture cooperation and intelligence, but these did not remove danger. They only improved the odds. No single explanation fully accounts for how our lineage endured, while so many others faded, but genetic evidence suggests that endurance was not guaranteed. The genetic record also preserves movement. When populations separate, mutations accumulate differently. When they meet again, those histories mingle. Over time, DNA becomes a map of contact and distance. It can show that groups were isolated, then connected, then isolated again. It can reveal expansions that archaeology barely sees. It can suggest that some populations contributed to later people only in small amounts. But this map is difficult to read. Genetic signals blur over time. Later migrations can overwrite older patterns. Ancient DNA from key regions may be missing. Researchers must infer from fragments, and the conclusions can shift as new data appears. The evidence remains incomplete, and caution is essential. Still, the broad image is powerful. Early humans live in a world of small numbers and deep ancestry. Their story is not only written in tools and fossils, but in the invisible inheritance carried forward by survivors. Imagine a small group near a shrinking lake. They may have customs, names, scars, songs, favorite camps, and memories of ancestors. They may endure for many generations. Then the lake fails and they move. Some join another group, some die. Some children survive and have children elsewhere. Tens of thousands of years later, almost nothing remains except a faint genetic contribution, folded into descendants who never know the source. The group has vanished as a people, but not entirely as ancestry. This is one of the strange truths of human disappearance. Vanishing does not always mean leaving nothing. Sometimes it means becoming unrecognizable. A population can disappear culturally while surviving biologically in another group. A language, a set of stories, and a way of life may die while some genes continue. The reverse can also happen. A cultural tradition may spread beyond the people who began it. Deep history is full of such separations. The genetic record can show mixture, but it cannot recover the lost meanings attached to that mixture. It tells us that people met. It cannot always tell us whether they met through alliance, exchange, migration, adoption, coercion, conflict, or love. The ghostly nature of this evidence gives the early human story a different emotional weight. The empty world was not empty of people who mattered. It was full of populations that had futures until they did not. Some became ancestors of billions. Others narrowed into silence. Some may have been absorbed into expanding groups. Some may have been isolated too long. Some may have been erased by climate shifts that left no dramatic disaster layer, only a gradual loss of viability. In deep time, extinction can be quiet. It does not always arrive as a catastrophe. Sometimes it arrives as fewer births, fewer meetings, fewer remembered roots, fewer surviving grandchildren. And yet this genetic fragility also shows the strength of the human thread. Despite bottlenecks and vanished branches, the lineage continues. It continues not as a pure line, but as a braided one. Survival comes through connection, as much as persistence. Groups meet and mix. Isolated histories recombine. Diversity stored in separate populations may help later humans adapt. The species becomes itself through the movement of genes and knowledge across landscapes that repeatedly divide and reconnect people. By the time later Homo sapiens begin expanding more dramatically beyond Africa, they carry this deep African inheritance within them. They are not the beginning of the story, but the descendants of countless earlier experiments in survival. Inside them are traces of ancient separations, refugees, expansions, and losses. Their bodies remember what no mind can. Their genomes preserve shadows of people whose tools may lie undiscovered or whose camps have turned to dust. The first 250,000 years therefore become less empty the closer one looks. They're crowded with invisible ancestry. They contain lost populations, failed expansions, local survivals, and forgotten mixtures. The silence is not absence, it is compression. A vast human past has been reduced to faint signals in bone, stone, and blood. And those signals suggest that before everything changed, humanity came close enough to uncertainty that its survival should not be taken for granted. The world was wide, the groups were small, and the future rested on fragile lines of descent moving through changing land. The first journeys beyond Africa do not look like conquest. They look like hesitation, opportunity, retreat, and disappearance. Long before Homo sapiens fills Eurasia, long before people reach Australia or cross into the Americas, there are earlier movements outward that seem to begin and then fade. A favourable climate opens a corridor. Grasslands spread where desert once blocked passage. Animals move north and east. Human groups follow water-prey plants and coastlines into regions beyond the continent where their species formed. For a moment the world seems to widen. Then the trace thins, breaks, or vanishes. The empty world has edges, and early humans test them more than once. These early departures are difficult to reconstruct because they rarely leave clean evidence. A few fossils, scattered tools, and debated dates must carry enormous weight. Some finds suggest Homo sapiens or closely related populations reached the eastern Mediterranean far earlier than the later Great Expansion. A jawbone, a skull fragment, a tool assemblage, a layer in a cave, each becomes a clue in a story where most pages are missing. What survives in the record suggests that humans left Africa in pulses, not in one triumphant wave. Some of those pulses may have failed completely, others may have left small traces in later ancestry. Scholars still debate which early finds represent direct ancestors of later populations and which belong to branches that ended. The route out of Africa is not a single road. The northeastern pathway through the Nile Valley and Sinai offers one possibility during wetter periods. The southern route across the Red Sea region or along coastal Arabia offers another, especially when sea levels are lower and climates more favourable. Arabia itself is not always the dry barrier it appears to be today. At times it contains lakes, rivers, grasslands, and animals moving through corridors that link Africa with Eurasia. Stone tools found in Arabia suggest repeated human presence during wetter windows, though assigning every toolmaker precisely to species can be difficult. The evidence remains incomplete, but the old image of a single late exit has given way to a more restless pattern. Yet leaving Africa is not the same as surviving beyond it. A group can move into a new region and thrive for generations, then vanish when conditions change. Arabia can green, then dry. The Levant can offer woodland grassland, and game then become harsher. Populations at the edge of their range may be especially vulnerable. They may be small, isolated, and dependent on narrow ecological windows. If the climate turns, they may retreat, merge with other groups, or die out. From the perspective of deep time, these early expansions may look like sparks carried into a wind that is not yet ready to sustain fire. There is something haunting about these failed or partial journeys. They remind us that Homo sapiens did not simply burst from Africa as an unstoppable species. Early humans entered landscapes already occupied by other animals, other climates, and in some places other human relatives. They were capable, but capability did not guarantee permanence. A group reaching a new valley might know nothing of the continent beyond. They were not pioneers in the modern heroic sense. They were families, hunters, gatherers, children, elders, and tool-makers responding to the possibilities in front of them. Their world expanded one water source at a time. The archaeological record outside Africa before the later expansion is often fragmentary. Some sites show modern humans present in the Levant during earlier warm phases then absent later. This pattern suggests that the region may have served as a corridor, a refuge, or a temporary frontier depending on climate. It is a place where Africa and Eurasia meet, where animals and humans can pass during favourable periods. But it is also a place where populations can be squeezed by deserts, mountains, and changing habitats. A human presence there may not mean a continuous occupation stretching into later history. It may mean arrival persistence for a time and disappearance. One lesser-known detail is that early dispersals may have followed animals into environments that later became unrecognizable. Ancient lakes in Arabia, now dry basins, once supported ecosystems rich enough for repeated human visits. Tools found near these paleo lakes hint at people moving through what are now deserts. To imagine those sites only as sand is to misunderstand them. The people who passed there may have seen waterbirds grazing animals, reeds, mud, and green margins. They may have camped beside fresh water, under skies that later generations would know only as desert heat. When the wet phase ended, the route closed behind them like a door. Coastal routes present another mystery. If early humans moved along shorelines, much of the evidence may now be underwater, because sea levels rose after glacial periods. The camp's shell middens and lowland pathways that might explain how people moved could lie submerged beyond modern beaches. This missing evidence makes the story feel more abrupt than it may have been. A dispersal that appears sudden inland may have been preceded by long coastal movement that archaeology has barely touched. No single explanation fully accounts for the gaps, and the drowned record remains one of the great silences in human origins research. There is also the question of what happened when early Homo sapiens met other humans. In Western Eurasia, Neanderthals already occupy many regions. They know cold landscapes, seasonal movement, large game hunting, and local materials. They are not background figures waiting to be replaced. They are established populations with their own histories. Early modern humans moving into or near their territories may have encountered them directly or indirectly. The nature of those encounters remains uncertain. Later genetic evidence shows interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but whether the earliest excursions included sustained contact is harder to prove. Still, the possibility adds complexity to every movement beyond Africa. Failed dispersals do not mean failure in any simple human sense. A population may live successfully outside Africa for thousands of years and still leave no lasting descendants. In deep time, even a long occupation can become a vanished episode. The difference between success and disappearance may be climate timing, population size, contact with neighbours, disease, or chance. A group could master a region, raise generations there, and still be erased by later shifts. History remembers outcomes, but life is lived before the outcome is known. These early movements also show that curiosity and adaptability were already present. Humans did not remain confined to one homeland until some final transformation suddenly released them. They explored when routes opened. They crossed unfamiliar ground. They adjusted to new animals, plants, stones, and seasons. The problem was not leaving. The problem was sustaining a lasting presence across vast and variable landscapes. For a species still thinly populated, expansion was easy to begin and hard to maintain. Over time, repeated exits may have mattered even if they did not directly lead to the later global spread. They may have tested routes, expanded ecological knowledge, or brought populations into contact with new pressures. They may have contributed small genetic traces now difficult to separate. They may have shaped traditions that later disappeared. The evidence remains too incomplete to turn these journeys into a neat sequence, but their very existence changes the tone of the story. The long empty age was not a stagnant wait inside Africa. It was a restless era of openings and losses. A band moving north through a green corridor would not know that future scientists might call their movement an early dispersal. They would know the practical world water ahead. Animals moving children, tired stone needed strangers, possible weather changing. They might cross into lands no one in their ancestry had known. They might survive there for generations. Then the dry years might come, or a colder cycle or competition or isolation. Their trace might narrow to one fossil, one tool horizon, one disputed layer in a cave, and even that might be lucky. So the story of leaving Africa begins not with a single arrow on a map, but with many uncertain lines, some fading almost as soon as they appear. These early paths reveal a species capable of movement, but not yet capable of overwhelming the world. They show humanity pressing against its boundaries, finding doors that open only briefly, and learning through survival and disappearance that the planet is larger, harsher, and more complicated than any one group can master. The great expansion will come later. For now, the world allows experiments, and most experiments are swallowed by time. Beyond Africa, the world is not waiting empty. It is already inhabited by other humans, older cousins with deep roots in landscapes that Homo sapiens has only begun to touch. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals move through cold valleys, wooded refuges, open steppe, and limestone caves. Farther east, Denisovans leave traces in bone sediment and the genomes of living people, though their bodies remain mostly hidden from view. In Ireland, Southeast Asia, other strange human lineages persist in ways that make the human family tree look less like a ladder and more like a thicket. When early Homo sapiens begins to look beyond Africa, it does not enter a vacant planet. It enters a world of relatives. Neanderthals are the best known of these other humans, partly because their fossils are more numerous, and partly because they lived in regions where preservation is often kinder than in the tropics. For a long time they were imagined as brutish failures, heavy-browed figures standing just outside the circle of true humanity. That image has not survived modern evidence. Neanderthals made tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, cared for injured individuals, used pigments in some contexts, and occupied difficult environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They were physically powerful, well adapted to cold, and deeply knowledgeable about their territories. They were not failed versions of us. They were another way of being human. Their world is demanding. Ice Age Europe is not one continuous frozen wasteland, but it is harsh, unstable, and often dangerous. Grasslands expand and contract. Forests retreat and return. Herds of horse, bison, reindeer, mammoth, and other animals move across seasonal ranges. Neanderthal groups must understand these movements intimately. They hunt at close range, sometimes taking enormous risks. Many skeletons show injuries that suggest hard lives, though interpreting the exact causes is difficult. They use stone tools associated with traditions such as the Mousterian shaping flakes, and points with skill. They make choices about raw materials, camp locations, and hunting strategies that reflect intelligence and planning. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is enough to remove any serious doubt that they were capable, social, and adaptive. Denisovans are more ghostly. For years they were known mainly from DNA extracted from a small finger bone and teeth found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. Later evidence expanded their presence, but they remain far less visible than Neanderthals. Their genetic legacy, however, is extraordinary. Denisovan ancestry appears in varying amounts among some living populations, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia, suggesting that they or related groups were once spread across a vast region. This means that a human population barely represented by fossils may have occupied enormous landscapes. It is a reminder that the fossil record can badly understate the number and range of ancient human groups. The Denisovan story also reveals how much remains unknown. What did they look like? How many different Denisovan-related populations existed? Did they live in forests, mountains, coasts, or high plateaus? The answer may be all of these, but the details are still emerging. One remarkable clue connects Denisovan ancestry with adaptation to high altitude in Tibetan populations through a gene variant that appears to have come from Denisovan-related humans. This is a lesser-known but striking example of ancient mixture becoming useful far in the future. A vanished population leaves behind not only ancestry, but a biological tool that helps later people live where oxygen is thin. What survives in the record suggests that contact between human groups sometimes carried consequences across tens of thousands of years. Other human relatives complicate the picture further. Homo floresiensis, found on the island of Flores, was small-bodied and survived surprisingly late in Southeast Asia. Homo luzonensis, identified from fossils in the Philippines, adds another unexpected branch. These island humans show that human evolution produced isolated experiments shaped by geography, limited resources, and long separation. They also remind us that when Homo sapiens eventually spreads widely, it enters a world where different human forms may still occupy pockets of land, caves, forests, and islands. The planet is not simply divided between us and Neanderthals, it is a mosaic. For early Homo sapiens meeting these relatives would not have meant recognizing them as separate species in the scientific sense. They would have been strangers, perhaps familiar in outline and unfamiliar in detail. Their bodies, tools, smells, behaviors, and territories may have seemed close enough to be understood and different enough to be unsettling. Some encounters may have been distant, marked only by abandoned camps or overlapping hunting grounds. Others may have involved direct contact competition, avoidance, exchange, violence, or mating. Later DNA proves that at least some of these meetings resulted in interbreeding. Most people outside Africa today carry some Neanderthal ancestry, and some carry Denisovan ancestry as well. The boundary between us and them was porous. This porosity is one of the great revelations of modern human origins. Earlier stories often imagine replacement modern humans arrive, archaic humans vanish. The truth is more tangled. Replacement happened in the broad sense because Neanderthals and Denisovans no longer exist as distinct populations. But before they disappeared, they mixed with the expanding Homo sapiens populations. Their genes entered ours. Their separate histories did not simply end outside us. Fragments of them continued inside us. No single explanation fully accounts for why Homo sapiens survived, while these other humans disappeared, but the outcome was not clean separation. It was survival through absorption, as well as loss. The presence of other humans may have shaped Homo sapiens in ways that are hard to measure. Competition with Neanderthals could have influenced hunting strategies, territorial behavior, or movement patterns. Contact with Denisovan-related groups may have opened knowledge of new landscapes or resources, though direct evidence for cultural exchange is difficult to prove. Even the awareness of other human groups may have affected social boundaries. If early Homo sapiens already lived in a world where strangers could be dangerous or valuable, then encountering different humans would intensify that ancient problem: who counts as kin, who counts as rival, and who can become part of the group. There is also the possibility that Homo sapiens learned from these encounters, but caution is needed. It is tempting to imagine modern humans borrowing tools, routes, or survival strategies from Neanderthals and Denisovans, and in some cases cultural exchange may have occurred. But proving it archaeologically is difficult because similar tools can arise independently, and artifacts do not carry labels identifying their makers. Scholars still debate many cases of possible influence. The safest conclusion is that contact created opportunities for exchange, but the details remain uncertain. What is certain is that the old idea of human uniqueness becomes harder to maintain. Neanderthals had large brains. Denisovans adapted to vast and varied environments. Island humans survived under unusual pressures. Earlier human species had already mastered fire tools and migration long before Homo sapiens became dominant. Our species did not inherit an empty throne. It emerged into a family already ancient, then eventually became the last surviving branch. That loneliness is recent. For most of our existence, being human did not mean being alone. The disappearance of these other humans remains one of the deep mysteries of prehistory. Climate instability likely played a role. Small population sizes made groups vulnerable. Competition with expanding Homo sapiens may have added pressure. Interbreeding may have absorbed some populations. Disease, ecological change, and demographic disadvantage may all have contributed. No single cause fully explains the pattern across different regions. Neanderthals vanish in Western Eurasia around the time modern humans become more widespread there, but the process may have varied from place to place. Denisovan-related groups may have persisted in parts of Asia longer than the limited fossil record shows. The end was probably not one event but many local endings. For the story of the first 250,000 years of Homo sapiens, these other humans matter, because they reveal that our later success was not inevitable. There were alternatives. Other humans had survived for immense spans of time. Some were established in Eurasia before our species left Africa in lasting numbers. They knew landscapes that newcomers had to learn. They had bodies shaped by different histories. If the climate had shifted differently, if populations had expanded at different times, if encounters had produced different outcomes, the final human world might not have belonged only to Homo sapiens, and yet eventually it does. The empty world inside Africa begins as a scatter of small bands. Beyond Africa, the wider world is occupied by relatives. When the great expansion finally comes, it will not move into silence but into contact. Some of those contacts will leave genetic traces that survive in billions of people. Others will leave only questions. The last Neanderthal campfire dies without a written witness. The Denisovan face remains mostly unknown. Island lineages vanish into caves and fragments. By the end, Homo sapiens stands alone, carrying within its body pieces of the humans who did not. This changes the meaning of modern humanity. We are not the pure survivors of a simple race. We are the descendants of a long and tangled human world, one in which boundaries blurred, populations met and vanished, relatives became part of us. The first 250,000 years were almost empty in terms of human numbers, but they were not empty of human variety. Before everything changed, Earth was home to multiple ways of being human. The fact that only one remains is not proof that only one mattered. It is a reminder that deep history is full of endings we barely understand. For a long time, humanity seems to stand near a threshold without crossing it. The ingredients are present, but the transformation remains incomplete. Homo sapiens has a modern body, a powerful brain, skilled hands, flexible movement, firestone tools, social bonds, memory, and the ability to survive across changing environments. Small groups have endured droughts, green corridors, lost coastlines, and repeated isolation. Some have moved beyond Africa. Some have met other humans, some have vanished. Yet the world is still not visibly remade. The human footprint remains light. The great acceleration has not yet begun. This long threshold is one of the most fascinating periods in the human story because it resists simple explanation. It is tempting to search for a single switch. Language appears, imagination awakens tools, improve, climate opens, Population grows, and suddenly history begins. But the evidence does not support such a clean moment. What survives in the record suggests a gradual thickening of capacities and connections. Different regions show different signs at different times. A pigment tradition appears here. Long-distance material movement appears there. More careful blade production emerges in one place, while symbolic objects appear in another. The change is uneven, scattered, and often interrupted. Scholars still debate whether this reflects real differences in behavior or the patchiness of preservation. The threshold may have been demographic before it was technological. A small population can contain brilliant individuals and still fail to build cumulative culture. A larger, better connected population can preserve more experiments, combine ideas from different groups, and recover more quickly from loss. As human numbers slowly grow in certain regions, the social memory of the species becomes harder to erase. A useful technique no longer depends on one expert. A tradition can survive the death of a band because neighboring groups also know it. Ideas can travel farther than the people who first created them. Culture begins to gain a kind of durability. This does not happen everywhere at once. It may begin in pockets in favorable environments, where resources are reliable enough to support larger gatherings or repeated contact. Coasts, lakeshores, river systems, and ecotones between different habitats may matter because they bring diverse resources together. A group living near such richness can afford more time for tool refinement, ornament-making, exchange, or ritual. But abundance alone is not enough. People must meet, teach, imitate, compete, and cooperate. The threshold is not simply about food, it is about the density of human relationships. One subtle clue comes from materials that move across distance. When stone shells, pigments, or other objects appear far from their source, they suggest either long-range travel or exchange between groups. Both possibilities matter. A tool made from distant stone is more than a tool. It is evidence of a world larger than one camp. A shell carried inland may signal ornament, memory, identity, or connection to a coastline. These objects hint that human landscapes are becoming socially wider. The Earth is still vast, but the mental map is expanding. People may know not only where resources lie, but where other people can be found. Symbolism also seems to intensify near this threshold, though it remains difficult to interpret. Ochre pieces with scraping marks, perforated shells, engraved patterns, and carefully selected objects suggest that humans are increasingly investing meaning in materials. The meaning itself is lost. A mark may represent ownership, identity, counting, decoration, ritual, or something else entirely. No single explanation fully accounts for these traces, but their appearance across multiple contexts suggests that people are not merely using the world. They are marking it, classifying it, and perhaps using objects to communicate social information beyond the immediate moment. Language, if already present in some form, may become more powerful as networks widen. A small vocabulary can coordinate simple tasks, but a richer language can transmit myths, rules, kinship, distant geography, tool sequences, warnings, and memory across generations. It can make invisible relationships visible. It can turn a stranger into a relative through ancestry, marriage, or shared story. It can carry knowledge of places never seen by the listener. The exact evolution of language remains uncertain, but by the time Homo sapiens begins expanding dramatically, some form of highly flexible communication must be in place. Without it, the later speed of cultural transmission becomes difficult to explain. The threshold is also cognitive, but not in the old simplistic sense that early humans were waiting for a sudden mental upgrade. The modern view is more careful. Brain anatomy development, social learning, and cultural environment interact. A brain grows inside a world of teaching. A child surrounded by more tools, stories, rules, and social roles develops within richer cultural scaffolding. Culture can make cognition more powerful without requiring a new species-level mutation at the exact moment change becomes visible. In other words, the mind and the social world may have amplified each other. More culture creates more learning demands. More learning capacity supports more culture. This feedback loop may be the hidden engine of the threshold. A slightly larger network preserves more innovations. More innovations make social learning more valuable. Better communication allows those innovations to spread. Wider exchange reduces isolation. Reduced isolation protects culture from local collapse. Over time, the system becomes more stable and more creative. Once a certain point is reached, change can accelerate not because humans suddenly become intelligent, but because intelligence is finally embedded in networks large enough to sustain it. There is a quiet drama in this. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human mind may have been capable of far more than the world allowed it to preserve. Then slowly conditions shift. Populations grow in some regions. Climatic windows open. Social ties extend. Material culture becomes more varied. Symbols begin to carry identity across distance. The same species that once left faint traces now starts leaving signals that are harder to miss. The threshold is crossed not with a single invention but with a strengthening web, yet fragility remains. Some early complex traditions appear and disappear. A site may show remarkable behavior, then later evidence fades. This tells us that the threshold is not a one-way gate at first. Complexity can retreat, networks can break, populations can shrink, climate can interrupt. The evidence remains incomplete, but it warns against imagining progress as a smooth upward line. Early humans may reach moments of cultural richness more than once, before those moments become widespread and lasting. This unevenness makes the later transformation even more remarkable. The world did not change simply because one group discovered art or one tool became better. It changed when enough human groups became connected enough, numerous enough, and flexible enough for innovations to accumulate faster than they vanished. The long threshold is the age when that balance begins to tilt. Loss still happens, but preservation improves. Isolation still exists, but contact increases. The empty world is not yet crowded, but the spaces between people are beginning to matter differently. If one could watch this process from above across tens of thousands of years, it might not look dramatic at first. A few more camps appear near water. A material travels farther. A pigment is used again in a different place. A tool form spreads. A group survives a harsh period because it can rely on allies beyond its immediate band. Children grow up hearing of people beyond their home range. A symbolic object marks belonging. A story preserves a root. These small changes accumulate quietly until they begin to alter the possibilities of the species. The long threshold, therefore, is not a pause before history. It is the slow formation of the conditions that make history recognizable. Human beings are becoming not just biological survivors but cultural accumulators. They are learning how to make knowledge endure beyond the fragile circle of one band. They are building without architecture a structure made of relationships, memory, symbols, and teaching. When everything finally changes, it will seem sudden only because the preparation was so long. And beneath it all, the old empty world remains present. The same landscapes still test people. The same climate cycles still open and close routes. The same dangers still stalk waterholes and dark camp edges. But now the human response is beginning to shift. A band is no longer only a band. It may be part of a wider network connected by marriage, exchange, memory, and shared signs. A tool is no longer only a tool. It may carry a style recognized by others. A shell is no longer only a shell. It may say something about who a person is where they have been or whom they belong to. The threshold is crossed first in fragments, then more firmly. The sparks that once flickered apart begin to find each other. The human world is still small, but it's becoming connected enough to change its own future. That is the quiet turning point before the visible revolution, not a sudden awakening, but the moment when human culture becomes strong enough to remember itself. The first unmistakable signals of a new human world are not always large. They're often small enough to fit in the hand a shell with a hole through it, a piece of ochre ground smoothed by use, a pattern scratched onto stone, a shaped bone point, a bead carried far from the shore, a burial arranged with a care that ordinary disposal does not explain. These things do not look like the beginning of a planetary transformation. They do not tower over valleys or change the course of rivers, but they reveal a mind increasingly concerned with more than survival in the immediate moment. They suggest identity, memory, belonging, and meaning moving through objects. Pigment is one of the most important clues. Ochre appears in many prehistoric contexts, and its use can be practical, symbolic, or both. It can help process hides, protect skin-color bodies, mark objects, or participate in rituals that are now lost. The difficulty is that pigment does not explain itself. A red stain on stone can speak of craft, beauty, status, mourning play, or something else entirely. Scholars still debate the meanings behind early pigment use, and no single explanation fully accounts for every site. But repeated collection, grinding, and transport of pigment suggest that color mattered. In a world where most traces vanish, color is one of the first signs that humans are beginning to leave intentional marks on experience. Ornaments deepen the mystery. A perforated shell is a simple object, but it can carry enormous social weight. If worn on the body, it may communicate membership, age, partnership, skill, memory of a place, or connection to people beyond the local group. It may help strangers recognize one another. It may mark alliances. It may make identity visible before a word is spoken. What survives in the record suggests that such objects become more common as human networks widen. Their power lies not in their material value but in shared understanding. A shell only becomes a symbol when others know how to read it. This is a profound shift. A stone tool works even if no one agrees on its meaning. A blade cuts because of its edge. A bead, however, depends on social imagination. It means something because people collectively allow it to mean something. That ability to load objects with shared significance changes what human groups can do. It helps create trust beyond immediate kin. It allows alliances to be signaled. It lets people carry group identity across distance. It gives memory a physical form. The object remains small, but the social world around it expands. Burials where they appear add another layer. Not every ancient burial proves belief in an afterlife, and caution is necessary. Natural processes can place bones in unusual positions, and later disturbance can confuse interpretation. But deliberate treatment of the dead, especially when bodies are arranged, protected, or associated with objects, suggests that the dead are not always simply abandoned. They may remain socially important. The living may return to them, remember them, or mark their place. The evidence remains incomplete, but even rare burials hint that early humans are grappling with absence in ways that resemble later human concerns. Death is one of the oldest teachers of symbolism. A body is present, then not present in the same way. A person becomes memory. The group must respond. Perhaps the dead are feared, honored, mourned, or kept close through stories. None of this can be recovered directly from most early sites. Yet the careful handling of bodies in some contexts suggests that grief may have been structured by custom. If so, then the social world of Homo sapiens includes not only survival and cooperation, but ritualized memory. The past begins to have places. Engraved patterns are equally difficult and equally compelling. Lines scratched into ochre bone or stone may be decorative, mnemonic, symbolic, or experimental. They may not be writing, and they should not be treated as secret codes without evidence, but they show attention to repeated form. A pattern made intentionally is a decision to alter a surface in a way that may be seen again. It may communicate with others or with the maker's own memory. It may mark ownership, count something, or simply express a habit of design. Scholars still debate these interpretations, but the existence of such marks shows that human hands are increasingly making signs rather than only tools. The new mind is not a different brain appearing overnight. It is a mind increasingly visible because it leaves behind objects that archaeology can recognize as symbolic. The danger is to confuse visibility with origin. People may have told stories, decorated bodies, and made meanings long before durable traces survive. A painted skin, a woven band, a song, a dance, a spoken myth, or a pattern drawn in sand can vanish entirely. The archaeological record may capture only the moment when symbolic behavior begins to use materials tough enough to endure. So the question is not simply when humans became symbolic, it is when symbolic life became archaeologically visible. That distinction matters because it protects us from underestimating earlier people. The first beads we find are not necessarily the first beads ever made. The first preserved engraving is not necessarily the first sign. The earliest burial known to science is not necessarily the earliest act of mourning. What survives is a minimum, not a beginning. The evidence remains incomplete, and the invisible portion may be vast. Still, the preserved signals show that by this threshold period, human groups are increasingly externalizing thought. Meaning is being placed onto bodies, objects, places, and perhaps landscapes. Long-distance materials reveal how symbolic life and social networks may reinforce each other. A shell carried far inland becomes more than decoration. It is proof of connection to a coast either through travel exchange or memory. A stone from a distant source may show knowledge of wider terrain. Pigments transported across a landscape may indicate repeated movement or special value. These materials create bridges between places. They allow a person to wear or carry geography. In an almost empty world, such objects may have helped make distance socially manageable. One surprising detail is that symbolic objects may become especially important when populations expand and strangers meet more often. In tiny groups where everyone knows everyone, identity is obvious. In wider networks, visible signs become useful. They can reduce uncertainty. They can show affiliation status or shared tradition. This does not mean ornaments were invented only for social signaling, but signaling may have strengthened their value. As human contact increases, symbols help organize trust. They make relationships portable. Technology also begins to show more planning and specialization in some regions. Bone tools, carefully shaped points, blades, and compound weapons suggest a growing command of materials beyond stone. Bone and antler require different techniques. They may be scraped ground, polished, or shaped slowly. Such work takes time and intention. In later periods, these materials become central to fishing, sewing, hunting, and ornamentation. Their earlier appearances hint at expanding technical imagination. Again, the pattern is uneven, but the direction is significant. The connection between symbol and technology may be deeper than it first appears. Both require imagining something not yet present. A toolmaker sees a future edge inside a core. A beadmaker sees social meaning inside a shell. A group arranging a burial sees a dead body as more than matter. These acts differ, but each depends on projecting meaning beyond the immediate surface of things. Human cognition becomes powerful, not only because it solves practical problems, but because it can create shared worlds. As these signals multiply, the empty world begins to feel less empty. It is still sparsely populated, still dangerous, still shaped by climate, but human presence is becoming more legible. People are not only moving through landscapes, they are marking themselves and perhaps marking the world. They are carrying signs of belonging. They are placing memory into materials. They are turning objects into messages that can outlast the moment of making. This does not mean that every group follows the same path. Some may rely heavily on ornaments, others may leave few symbolic traces. Some may use perishable materials that disappear. Some traditions may flourish briefly and vanish. The record is uneven, and scholars still debate how to interpret regional differences. But the broader pattern suggests that the long threshold is giving way to a more visibly human world, one where culture begins to accumulate not just as technique but as meaning, and meaning changes the future. A population bound only by immediate kinship has limited reach. A population that can signal identity, remember distant ties, and share symbols can build wider alliances. A tool can help win food. A symbol can help build the social world that makes survival more reliable. It can help turn scattered bands into networks. It can make cooperation possible between people who do not grow up in the same camp. In that sense, a shell bead may be as important as a spear point. The first 250,000 years were almost empty because human beings were few, scattered and fragile. But near the turning point, the signs become harder to miss. Colour, ornament, burial pattern and distance begin to speak through the ground. They do not give us full stories. They give us flashes, a red-stained object, a pierced shell, a careful arrangement of bones, a line scratched with intention. These are not the whole mind, but they are openings into it. Through them, the silence of deep time begins to carry a faint human voice. Once symbols begin to travel, people begin to travel differently too. The movement is no longer only a search for food, water, stone shelter, or safety. It becomes a movement through relationships. A shell carried inland, a pigment source visited again and again, a tool style recognized beyond one valley, a marriage partner arriving from another group. Each of these small traces suggests that the human world is becoming wider than the daily range of a single band. The land is still immense, the population is still thin, but the spaces between people are no longer only empty spaces. They are beginning to become connections. This change is quiet enough that it can be missed. There is no single monument announcing the birth of networks. There is no written treaty, no carved map, no named road. Instead, archaeology finds hints, materials far from their sources, ornaments made in shared styles, repeated use of certain places, similarities between tool traditions across distance, and signs that people sometimes gathered in larger numbers than a small family group. What survives in the record suggests that early Homo sapiens gradually learned to make social life stretch across landscapes. The result was not civilization, not yet, but it was one of the foundations that later made civilization possible. A larger network changes the value of almost everything. A tool-making improvement can move beyond the person who invents it. A survival trick learned in one dry season can be carried into another region. A dangerous place can become known through warning rather than experience. A distant group can become a source of mates, allies, objects, stories, and refuge. In a small isolated band, a crisis can be fatal. In a wider network, crisis can be absorbed. People can move toward relatives, exchange resources, or join others when local conditions fail. No single explanation fully accounts for the later success of Homo sapiens, but the growth of these networks is one of the strongest candidates. The importance of mating networks is easy to overlook because it sounds biological rather than dramatic. Yet for small populations it is crucial. If groups remain too isolated, they risk inbreeding demographic decline and cultural loss. If they maintain ties with neighbouring groups, they gain genetic diversity and social resilience. A young person moving between bands can carry more than ancestry. They can carry songs, tool techniques, ornaments, stories, and memories of distant water sources. They become a bridge made of flesh and knowledge. In this sense, human expansion begins not with armies or migrations, but with marriages, visits, exchanges, and the slow widening of trust. Trust, however, is never automatic. Strangers can be dangerous. A group that shares food too freely may be exploited. A group that refuses contact may become isolated. Symbols may help solve this problem. Ornaments, body markings, styles of tool-making, and shared rituals can make identity visible. They may signal who belongs to which group, who has ties to whom, who can be approached, and who should be treated with caution. Scholars still debate the precise meanings of early ornaments, but their social usefulness is clear in principle. In a world where speech communities and kin groups stretch across distance, visible signs can reduce uncertainty. Gathering places may have played a special role. A lake margin, a river crossing a stone source, a seasonal hunting ground, or a sheltered coastal cave could bring separate groups together at predictable times. These meetings may have been practical, social, ceremonial, or all of these at once. People could exchange partners, objects, information, and perhaps stories of lands beyond their own. Children might see strangers who were not enemies. Elders might renew ties formed long ago. Toolmakers might observe different techniques. Such gatherings are difficult to prove directly, but the repeated use of resource-rich places suggests that some landscapes acted as social magnets. One lesser-known detail is that exchange does not need to involve formal trade. Objects can move through many hands as gifts favours marriage, ties, shared ritual, or simple carrying. A shell found far inland does not necessarily mean one person walked from the coast to that exact site. It may have passed from group to group, accumulating meaning as it moved. Its journey may matter as much as its origin. By the time it reaches a distant wearer, it may represent not only the sea, but a chain of relationships. The object becomes a small piece of geography transformed into social memory. These growing networks also help explain why culture begins to accumulate more reliably. In the older, thinner world, knowledge could vanish with a local disaster. But if several groups share a technique, it is harder to erase. If people meet often enough to compare methods, improvements can spread. If children see multiple ways of making tools or organizing tasks, they inherit a broader menu of possibilities. Culture becomes less brittle. It can survive local loss because it is distributed across many minds. The network becomes a storage system long before writing exists. This is one of the great hidden revolutions of prehistory. Humans begin to store knowledge not in books or monuments but in relationships. A route is remembered because several groups use it. A technique survives because many hands practice it. A symbolic style persists because many people recognize it. A story travels because it matters to more than one camp. The human mind is still individual, but human memory is becoming collective across distance. That collective memory may be the true engine of the later transformation. Language would have amplified this process enormously. With rich speech, people can describe a water source beyond the horizon, explain how a tool is made, warn of hostile groups, name kinship obligations, recount past meetings, and preserve rules of exchange. Language allows absent places and absent people to shape present decisions. It turns the landscape into a network of remembered possibilities. The evidence for ancient language remains indirect, but by the time these social connections strengthen, the communicative demands are substantial. What survives in the record suggests behavior that is difficult to imagine without flexible shared communication. Networks also create competition, and competition can sharpen creativity. Groups may compare ornaments, hunting success, tool quality, or access to valued materials. Individuals may gain status by making beautiful objects, remembering distant routes, negotiating alliances, or mastering difficult techniques. This does not mean early societies were hierarchical in the later state-level sense, but social reputation likely mattered. A skilled maker, healer, tracker, or storyteller could influence group survival. As contacts widen, reputation can travel too. A person may become known beyond the camp where they sleep. Still, the growth of networks is not a smooth ascent. Climate can break them. Drought can force groups apart. Flooded coastlines can drown meeting places. Conflict can close routes. Disease can move through contact as well as knowledge. The same connections that make humans resilient can also carry danger. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is likely that early networks expanded and contracted repeatedly, strengthening in favorable periods and thinning during crisis. The difference is that over time some networks become durable enough to recover. This durability marks a turning point. A species that once survived in scattered sparks begins to form constellations. The individual fires remain separate, but lines of meaning connect them. A person can belong to a local band, and also to a wider world of related groups, shared symbols, distant materials, and remembered paths. That wider world does not need cities to exist. It needs recognition. It needs repeated contact. It needs the understanding that people beyond the immediate camp are part of one's survival horizon. As networks grow, the empty world begins to shrink without the land changing size. A mountain remains difficult. A desert remains dangerous. A coastline still shifts with sea level. But human knowledge now reaches beyond direct experience. A child may hear of places they have never seen. A group may plan movement based on information carried by visitors. A tool style may spread faster than any one person could travel. The world becomes socially smaller before it becomes physically crowded. This is why the later Great Expansion will be so different from the earlier failed dispersals. Humans will not move as isolated sparks into unknown darkness. They will move with deeper cultural toolkits, stronger social memory, more flexible symbols, and wider capacities for cooperation. They will still face danger, and many journeys will still fail, but the species now has better ways to carry knowledge forward. The network allows experience to accumulate beyond a single lifetime and beyond a single group. The first 250,000 years were almost empty because people were few and connections were fragile. But near the end of that long beginning, the web tightens. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not without interruption, yet enough to matter. A shell crosses inland. A pigment tradition persists. A route is remembered. A stranger becomes kin. A method survives because more than one group knows it. These are small events, but together they change the nature of human possibility. The world has not yet been transformed by humans, but humans are beginning to transform one another at a scale large enough to endure. Then, after an almost endless beginning, the human story begins to move with startling speed. Not speed as measured by a single lifetime, but speed in the language of deep time. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens exists mostly as scattered populations vulnerable to climate distance and isolation. Then the pattern changes. Human groups spread farther, endure more successfully, and begin appearing across lands that had once been occupied by other humans or by no humans at all. The old sparks become a moving fire. The empty world, which had seemed too vast for our species to fill, begins to shrink beneath human feet. This great expansion does not begin from nothing. It carries everything formed during the long threshold portable technology, social memory, flexible communication, symbolic identity, wider mating networks, and a growing capacity to preserve knowledge across distance. Earlier humans had left Africa before, but those movements often faded. This time the dispersal lasts. The difference may not be one magic invention. It may be the combined strength of many changes reaching a critical point. The evidence remains incomplete, but by roughly the later part of the Pleistocene, Homo sapiens is no longer merely testing the edges of the known world. The species is beginning to occupy them. The routes are still debated. Some groups move through northeastern Africa into the Levant and beyond. Others may follow southern pathways along Arabia and coastal corridors when conditions allow. Lower sea levels expose lands now underwater, while wetter intervals open inland routes across regions that are dry today. The movement is probably not a single wave, but a braided pattern of pulses, pauses, detours, and local expansions. Yet the broad result is unmistakable. Modern humans establish themselves across Eurasia. They enter regions already shaped by Neanderthals and Denisovan-related groups. They adapt to forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, coasts, and cold steppes. The species that once left faint traces now begins to leave a continental presence. The spread into Eurasia changes the human world forever. In Western Eurasia, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlap. Their encounters leave genetic traces still carried by many people today. In parts of Asia, contact with Denisovan-related populations leaves another inheritance especially visible in some modern groups of Oceania and Asia. These meetings are not footnotes. They're reminders that expansion is not only movement through land, but movement through existing human worlds. Homo sapiens does not simply replace silence. It enters territories with histories, skills, and lineages of their own. Some of those lineages disappear as distinct peoples, yet fragments of them remain inside the expanding species. One of the most astonishing expansions leads towards Sahel, the ancient joined landmass of Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania during periods of lower sea level. Reaching Sahel requires crossing water. Even when sea levels are lower, there is no simple dryland bridge all the way from Southeast Asia. People must move through island landscapes and make deliberate or repeated sea crossings. This does not necessarily mean large ships in the later sense, but it does imply planning, coordination, and courage. Families, tools, fire-making knowledge, and social systems must cross water into a new continent of unfamiliar animals, plants, and seasons. That achievement alone marks a profound shift in human capability. Once in Sahul, humans encounter ecosystems unlike those of Africa or Eurasia. Giant marsupials, huge birds, reptiles, unfamiliar plants, and new fire regimes shape the landscape. The timing and causes of megafaunal extinctions in Australia remain debated, with climate change and human activity both discussed, and the evidence does not support a simple single-cause story everywhere. But human arrival clearly becomes part of a new ecological equation. For the first time, Homo sapiens is not merely surviving in old worlds, it is entering places where no human population has ever lived before, and beginning to alter the balance of life. Farther north, humans adapt to cold environments with increasing skill. Clothing shelters, fire-use tailored tools, and cooperative hunting become essential. Cold is not just discomfort, it is a technological challenge. Skin must be protected. Food must be stored or acquired in seasonal pulses. Fuel must be found. Movement must be planned around weather and animal migrations. The ability to live in these landscapes suggests not only physical toughness, but cultural depth. A naked human body is poorly suited to Ice Age cold. A cultural human body wrapped in knowledge, clothing, tools, and social cooperation can go much farther. This is one of the great secrets of the expansion. Humans do not adapt only by changing biologically. They adapt culturally. Instead of waiting for bodies to evolve thick fur, they make coverings. Instead of developing claws, they make blades. Instead of growing stronger jaws, they cook, cut, grind, and share. Instead of relying only on instinct, they carry memory across generations. Culture becomes a second inheritance faster than genes and more flexible than anatomy. What survives in the record suggests that this cultural inheritance becomes increasingly powerful during the expansion, allowing humans to occupy environments that would otherwise be impossible. The movement is not always continuous or easy. Populations may stall at barriers, retreat from harsh climates, or vanish locally. Ice sheets block routes, deserts expand, sea levels change, other human groups already occupy regions. Animals behave differently. Plants are unfamiliar. The Great Expansion is not a straight march across a blank map. It is a series of experiments in adaptation. Some succeed, some fail, and some leave only faint traces. Yet the cumulative result is different from earlier dispersals. The human presence keeps growing. As Homo sapiens spreads, the archaeological record becomes richer. Tools diversify. Ornaments appear more widely. Long-distance materials become more visible. Art emerges in spectacular forms in some regions, though not everywhere in the same way. Caves, rock shelters, open-air sites, and camps begin to show a species leaving more durable marks. The old invisibility does not disappear, but it weakens. Human beings are becoming harder for time to erase. There is a strange emotional contrast here. The expansion is impressive, but it is also full of loss. Other humans vanish. Many animal species face new pressures. Old landscapes change. Human success is not gentle simply because it is ancient. It carries consequences, some intentional, many not. A group entering a new land seeks food safety and a future for its children. It does not think of itself as a planetary force. But repeated across continents, those local acts become global transformation. The speed of this change would have been invisible to the people living it. No one experiences a species expansion. A person experiences a journey, a marriage, a hunt, a winter, a shoreline, a death, a child learning to walk. The grand pattern appears only from far above time. From there, the shift is astonishing. For hundreds of millennia, humans are few and scattered. Then within a comparatively short span, they become present across much of the old world and beyond. The almost empty world begins to carry human memory in many directions at once. This expansion does not yet create agriculture cities or states. Those are much later transformations, but it creates the human geography from which they will eventually arise. It places Homo sapiens in deserts, forests, tundra margins, islands, coasts, mountains, and plains. It generates regional traditions, adaptations, and identities. It spreads the species into contact with new materials, animals, risks, and possibilities. It turns humanity from an African species with outward experiments into a global species in formation. The old question follows every step. Why now? Why after so long? The answer is still debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for the change. Climate windows helped, population growth mattered, technology improved, language and symbolism strengthened cooperation. Networks carried knowledge farther. Chance opened some doors and closed others. Perhaps the real answer is that all of these forces converged. After 250,000 years of fragility, enough pieces finally aligned for expansion to become self-sustaining. The scattered sparks now move across the world. Some travel along rivers, some follow herds, some skirt deserts, some cross water, some enter caves where their descendants will leave art. Some meet other humans whose names will never be known. Some vanish, and some endure. The empty world is not empty anymore. It is still vast, still dangerous, still mostly wild, but the human thread has thickened into something stronger. It crosses continents now, it crosses seas, it carries stone fire memory symbols and the long inheritance of all those earlier generations who survived when nothing about survival was certain. The change is so large that it is easy to mistake it for a single cause. After so much slowness, after so many scattered bands and failed dispersals, Homo sapiens begins to spread, endure and transform its possibilities. It feels as if something must have happened, one hidden key turning in the lock of history. A new brain, a new language, a new weapon, a lucky climate window, a sudden leap in imagination. But deep history rarely works with such clean machinery. The more evidence appears, the harder it becomes to reduce the great transformation to one explanation. What changed was not one thing. It was the relationship between many things. Climate mattered. It opened routes that had been closed and softened barriers that had once broken movement apart. Wet phases turned deserts into corridors. Lower sea levels exposed coastal plains and shortened some crossings. Changing habitats pushed animals into new ranges and humans followed. Yet climate alone cannot explain everything because earlier favourable windows had also appeared and earlier movements had often faded. A green corridor can invite expansion, but it cannot guarantee that a population will survive beyond it. Opportunity is not the same as momentum. Population size mattered too. As groups became larger or more connected, culture became more stable. A useful invention had a better chance of surviving if many people knew it. A drought was less fatal if allies or relatives lived beyond the immediate camp. A child could learn from more than one expert. A new idea could be copied, refined, and carried into new places. This may be one of the deepest differences between the early empty world and the later expanding one. Human intelligence did not need to appear suddenly. It needed enough people and enough connections to stop being erased. Language may have been another decisive force, though its origins remain hard to prove. Flexible speech allows humans to coordinate, teach, warn, remember, negotiate, and imagine together. It makes absent places useful in present decisions. It turns memory into shared strategy. It allows people to explain not just what happened, but what might happen. Scholars still debate when fully modern language emerged, but the later expansion is difficult to imagine without powerful communication. Still, language by itself is not enough. A language spoken by an isolated group can vanish. Language becomes world-changing when carried by networks strong enough to preserve and spread what it contains. Technology mattered, but again not as one miraculous object. Stone tools improved in some traditions. Compound weapons became more effective. Bone antler plant fibers, adhesives, clothing containers and shelters likely expanded the human toolkit in ways only partly visible. Fire was used not just for warmth, but for cooking, protection, material processing, and social life. In cold regions, clothing and shelter were as important as blades. Near coasts, knowledge of tides, shellfish, fish, and boats, or rafts may have mattered. In each landscape, the useful toolkit was different. The revolution was not one invention, but the ability to assemble flexible solutions from many materials and traditions. Symbolism mattered because it made social life portable. Ornaments, pigments, styles, rituals, and shared meanings helped people recognize identity beyond the immediate family. They may have strengthened alliances, marked belonging, and helped strangers become predictable. A bead does not kill an animal, but it may help build the relationship that keeps a group alive during hunger. A painted body does not cross a desert, but it may signal who can be trusted at a distant gathering. No single explanation fully accounts for early symbolic behavior, but its connection to wider social networks is difficult to ignore. Chance mattered as well, though it is often the least satisfying explanation. A population may survive because it happens to be in the right refuge when drought comes. A route may open at the same time that a group has enough people to use it. A meeting between two groups may create a durable alliance or fail. A storm may destroy boats. A disease may weaken one population and spare another. A small difference repeated across generations can shape the future. Deep history is full of such accidents, most of them unrecoverable. The disappearance of other humans adds another layer. Neanderthals and Denisovan-related groups did not vanish because they were simply inferior. Their populations may have been smaller, more fragmented, and more vulnerable to climatic instability. Expanding Homo sapiens may have competed with them, interbred with them, absorbed some groups and displaced others. Disease may have played a role. Differences in social network size may have mattered more than differences in individual intelligence. The evidence remains incomplete, and the outcome likely varied by region. But the broad result is clear: Homo sapiens became the only surviving human species, not by remaining separate from others, but partly by carrying fragments of them forward. The deeper explanation may be cumulative culture. This is the ability for knowledge to build across generations in ways no individual could invent alone. A person learns a technique, improves it, slightly teaches it, and the next generation begins from that improved point. Over time, culture becomes a ladder, but the ladder is fragile unless many people hold it. During the first long age, the rungs may often have broken. Later, the ladder becomes stronger. Larger networks preserve more knowledge, and preserved knowledge allows further expansion, which creates still larger networks. Once this feedback begins, change can accelerate dramatically. This does not make humans inevitable rulers of Earth. It means a threshold was crossed where culture became resilient enough to survive local collapse and flexible enough to enter new worlds. The body of Homo sapiens remained an animal body vulnerable to hunger, cold, disease, injury, and fear. But that body now moved inside a growing cultural shell: tools, clothing, fire, language, kinship, memory, symbols, and exchange. This shell did not remove danger, but it allowed danger to be managed in more ways. It let humans live in places biology alone would not permit. There is a powerful irony here. The transformation that eventually makes humans dominant may have begun as a defense against fragility. Networks grow because isolated groups are vulnerable. Symbols matter because strangers are uncertain. Technology improves because landscapes are difficult. Language deepens because memory must travel. The strengths that later reshape the planet may have formed first as answers to weakness. Humanity becomes powerful, not because it is free from dependence, but because it learns to depend more widely on tools, on elders, on partners, on distant groups, on remembered roots, on inherited knowledge. So why did everything change? Because climate opened doors, but people had become better prepared to walk through them. Because populations grew, but networks made growth meaningful. Because tools improved, but teaching preserved them. Because symbols appeared, but shared meaning made them useful. Because language may have deepened, but social life gave it reach. Because other humans existed and contact changed the biological and cultural landscape. Because chance favored some groups and erased others. The answer is not a single spark. It is a fire built from many small fuels. The first 250,000 years were almost empty because each of these forces was still limited. Human groups were too scattered roots, too unstable networks, too thin, and culture too vulnerable to loss. Then slowly those limits weakened. Not everywhere, not smoothly and not permanently at first, but enough. Enough people survived. Enough knowledge was carried. Enough connections formed. Enough symbols were understood, enough roots opened, enough children learned from enough elders. The balance tipped. Once it tipped, the consequences widened beyond anything the first bands could have imagined. A species that once moved quietly through African landscapes began to occupy continents, cross-water encounter, and absorb other humans, alter ecosystems, and leave marks that time could not easily erase. Later would come farming villages, cities writing empires' machines, and the modern world. But the deeper turning point was earlier. It was the moment when humanity stopped being only scattered life and became a connected force. Still, the mystery remains partly intact. We can identify conditions, but we cannot fully recover the lived experience of crossing the threshold. We cannot hear the first stories that travelled between distant groups. We cannot know the names of the people whose alliances mattered, whose tools spread, whose journey succeeded, whose children carried the future. What survives in the record gives us structure, not intimacy. It tells us that something changed, and it gives us clues to why, but the human moments inside that change are mostly gone. Perhaps that is why the long empty beginning remains so compelling. It refuses the comfort of inevitability. For most of our existence, Homo sapiens was not obviously destined for city science or global dominance. It was a fragile species living in small groups beneath large skies. Then the fragile things memory cooperation teaching symbol trust became strong enough to alter the story. The world changed because humans became connected enough to carry change forward. The empty world never truly disappears. It remains beneath everything that follows, hidden under cities, roads, fields, languages, borders, and the noise of modern life. Long before civilization, long before farming, long before the first written names, there was the older human condition, small groups moving through immense landscapes, carrying knowledge in memory and survival in relationship. That beginning still lives inside us, not as nostalgia, and not as some simple idea of a lost natural life, but as inheritance. The first 250,000 years shape the human body, the human mind, and the human need for connection, long before history became visible enough to write down. Modern humans carry that past in their genes. Some people carry traces of Neanderthals. Some carry Denisovan ancestry. All living humans carry the deeper legacy of African populations that survived separation, reunion, drought, bottleneck, and migration. Inside every person is a record of ancestors who were never famous, never counted, never buried beneath monuments, and never remembered by name. They survived long enough for one more generation to exist. That may sound small, but across deep time it is everything. The modern world rests on an unbroken chain of ordinary survival. The landscapes remember too, though quietly. Deserts that seem eternal once held water. Coastal plains where people may have camped now lie beneath the sea. Caves preserve ash bones, pigments, tools, and sometimes art. River terraces hold stones shaped by hands long gone. Ancient lake beds keep the traces of animals and climates that vanished. The record is incomplete, but it is not silent. It tells of a species that began lightly, almost invisibly, then slowly became impossible to erase. What changed was not simply that humans became smarter. The story is deeper and more interesting than that. Humans became more connected. Knowledge began to survive beyond individuals. Symbols made identity portable. Language made distant places present in the mind. Networks made small groups less fragile. Culture became a force that could accumulate. Once that happened, the species crossed a threshold. The world that had once seemed too large to fill began to hold human traces almost everywhere, and yet the first long age is still the foundation. It reminds us that humanity's greatest power may have grown from vulnerability. We needed one another because alone we were weak. We remembered because forgetting could kill. We made tools because our bodies were unfinished for so many environments. We told stories because experience had to travel farther than one lifetime. We formed bonds because the world was too wide, too dangerous, and too changeable to face without them. The mystery, then, is not only why everything changed. It is how anything endured long enough to change at all. For hundreds of thousands of years the human line passed through uncertainty. Populations vanished, routes closed, other humans disappeared, climates shifted. The future narrowed again and again, but the thread did not break. Somewhere always people found water, carried children, shared food, taught skills, and moved on. That is the legacy of the almost empty world, not emptiness, but endurance. Before humanity filled the planet, it learned how to survive being small. The long human story does not end with a shout. It fades backward into windust water and footsteps crossing ground that has changed beyond recognition. The first people of our species did not know they stood at the beginning of anything. They did not know that their descendants would one day study stars, bury cables under oceans, build cities of glass, or ask where it all began. They knew hunger, weather, kinship, danger, and the pull of the next horizon. For most of our existence, humanity was not a force that dominated Earth. It was a fragile presence moving carefully through it. The world was larger than the human imagination could hold, and yet small memories mattered where the rain had fallen, where stone could be found, where strangers might gather, where the old route still led to water. These memories passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, until they became the hidden architecture of survival. Much has vanished. The songs are gone, the names are gone, the first stories are gone, the faces of most ancestors have returned completely to the earth. But something remains in every human life: the need to belong, the instinct to teach, the habit of making meaning, the ability to imagine a place not yet reached. And somewhere beneath the modern world, the older world is still visible: a dry lake bed, a cave wall, a red stone worn smooth, a shell carried far from the sea, a blade resting in sediment. Small things, almost nothing yet enough to show that people were there. Before everything changed, they crossed the empty world slowly, and because they did, we are here to remember the silence they left behind.